What if I told you that one of psychology's most famous experiments, the Stanford Prison Experiment that appears in every textbook and Netflix documentary, has some serious problems that most people never hear about? What if the dramatic story you learned about normal college students becoming brutal guards and broken prisoners in just 6 days doesn't tell the whole story? And here's the question that should make us all think twice. When scientific studies become cultural legends, how do we separate the real findings from the Hollywood version? You're about to discover what actually happened in Stanford's basement in 1971 based on decades of follow-up research, participant interviews, and methodological analysis that reveals a much more complex story than the simple narrative we've all been told. This isn't about conspiracy theories or academic fraud. It's about understanding how real science works, including its limitations. Stay with me because what you'll learn about how this experiment has been interpreted and reinterpreted over 50 years will change how you think about psychology research, media narratives, and the importance of asking critical questions about studies that seem too dramatic to be true. The official story tells us that ordinary college students quickly transformed into sadistic guards and traumatized prisoners, proving that situations can overpower individual personality. But when researchers started interviewing the actual participants decades later, a more nuanced picture emerged that challenges the simple narrative we've all heard. Douglas Corpy, the prisoner whose apparent psychological breakdown became the experiment's most famous moment, revealed something important in later interviews. "I was faking it. I had a graduate school interview coming up and wanted to get out of the experiment. The screaming and emotional distress that everyone talks about, I was putting on a performance because I thought it would get me released faster." This doesn't mean Corpy was lying or trying to deceive anyone maliciously. It means that in a high-pressure situation, people make strategic decisions about how to behave, which is actually a more interesting psychological finding than the simple story of situational corruption. Dave Eshelman, the guard who became known for his harsh treatment of prisoners, later explained his mindset. "I was consciously trying to be the tough guy. I thought that's what the experiment needed. I wasn't losing control or being corrupted by power. I was making deliberate choices about how to play this role." Again, this isn't evidence of deception. It's evidence that people are more aware and strategic in their behavior than the original interpretation suggested. Participants weren't passive victims of situational forces. They were active decision makers trying to figure out what was expected of them. What's fascinating is that many participants reported feeling conflicted during the experiment. They knew they were in an artificial situation. They were aware they were being observed and filmed, and they were consciously trying to balance being good research subjects with their personal moral boundaries. Dr. Craig Haney, who worked on the original experiment and later became a prison reform advocate, acknowledged these complexities. "We probably underestimated how much the participants were aware this was an experiment and were trying to figure out what we wanted them to do. That doesn't invalidate the findings, but it does complicate the simple story about situational power." Recent interviews with multiple participants reveal that many of them maintained friendships after the experiment and didn't experience lasting psychological trauma. This suggests that whatever happened during those 6 days, it wasn't the kind of fundamental personality transformation that the popular narrative describes. The real story isn't that the experiment was fake. It's that human psychology is more complex than any single study can capture, and participants were more thoughtful and strategic than the original interpretation gave them credit for. When psychologists started examining the Stanford Prison Experiment more carefully, they found methodological issues that don't necessarily invalidate the study, but do change how we should interpret its findings. Understanding these limitations helps us think more critically about all psychological research, not just this famous study. The biggest problem is something called demand characteristics, when participants figure out what researchers expect and consciously or unconsciously adjust their behavior accordingly. In the Stanford experiment, participants knew they were being filmed, knew this was psychology research, and knew the researchers were interested in prison dynamics. Dr. Peter Gray, who has written extensively about the experiment's limitations, explains, when you tell college students they're participating in a prison simulation and then film their every move, you're essentially asking them to act like they think prisoners and guards should act. That doesn't mean their behavior was meaningless, but it does mean we need to be careful about what conclusions we draw. The experiment also lacked what researchers call a control group. There was no comparison condition to help determine whether the observed behaviors were due to the prison environment specifically or just to being in any kind of unusual high-pressure social situation with assigned roles and constant observation. Sample size is another issue. 24 participants isn't necessarily too small for psychological research, but it does limit how confidently we can generalize the findings to other people and situations. Individual personalities and group dynamics can have big effects when you're studying small groups. The selection process also created some complications. Participants weren't randomly selected from the general population. They were college students who responded to newspaper ads looking for people willing to participate in a prison study. This might have attracted people with particular personality traits or interests that influenced the results. But here's what's important to understand. These methodological limitations don't mean the experiment was worthless or fraudulent. They mean it should be interpreted as one interesting study with specific limitations, not as definitive proof of universal truths about human nature. Modern psychology has developed better methods for studying these questions, including more naturalistic observations, larger sample sizes, and more sophisticated controls for demand characteristics. This ongoing scientific process of refinement and improvement is actually how good science works. The real lesson isn't that we can't trust psychological research. It's that we should understand how research methods affect findings and be appropriately cautious about drawing broad conclusions from any single study, no matter how famous or dramatic. Thanks for staying with me as we dive deeper into the real science behind this famous study. One of the most important developments in psychology over the past few decades has been the emphasis on replication, trying to repeat important experiments to see if the results hold up. When researchers tried to recreate aspects of the Stanford Prison Experiment, the results were much more complicated than the original dramatic narrative. The most notable attempt was a 2002 BBC documentary called The Experiment, which tried to replicate Zimbardo's study with better controls and ethical oversight. Instead of participants quickly falling into guard brutality and prisoner submission, the prisoners organized themselves, challenged the authority structure, and eventually took control of the situation. The guards were reluctant to use harsh tactics and often showed empathy for the prisoners. This doesn't prove that Zimbardo's results were wrong. Different participants, different time period, different cultural context, and different experimental procedures could all explain the different outcomes. But it does show that the pattern observed in 1971 isn't automatic or universal. Australian psychologist Alex Haslam conducted several controlled studies examining group behavior in hierarchical situations. His research found that people don't automatically abuse power when given authority. Instead, their behavior depends heavily on how they understand their role, what kind of leadership they're encouraged to provide, and what norms the situation establishes. Even more interesting, Haslam found that when people in authority positions believe their power is legitimate and beneficial, they often become more protective and supportive of those under their authority. This suggests that the relationship between power and behavior is much more complex than a simple power corrupts narrative. Multiple studies have found that individual personality differences remain strong predictors of behavior even in powerful situational contexts. People with more empathetic, conscientious, or pro-social personalities tend to maintain those characteristics even when placed in positions of authority over others. Research on actual prison guards and correctional officers has found enormous variation in behavior and attitudes. While some prison environments do encourage harsh treatment, many guards maintain professional, humane approaches to their work. This suggests that institutional culture and training matter more than simply having power over others. The key insight from all this follow-up research isn't that situations don't matter. They clearly do. It's that the relationship between situations and behavior is more complex, more dependent on individual differences, and more influenced by cultural norms and expectations than the simple Stanford narrative suggests. This is actually good news for thinking about social change and institutional reform. If behavior were completely determined by situations, it would be much harder to create positive change. But if people retain agency and decision-making capacity, even in challenging environments, then better training, clearer ethical guidelines, and more supportive institutional cultures can make a real difference. One of the most important aspects of the Stanford Prison Experiment isn't just what happened in the basement of a psychology building, but how the study has been used to understand and justify policies in real prisons, military settings, and other institutional contexts. Some of these applications have been helpful, others more problematic. On the positive side, the experiment contributed to important conversations about prison reform and the psychological effects of incarceration. It helped highlight how institutional environments can influence behavior and encouraged more attention to the mental health of both prisoners and correctional staff. The study also contributed to better ethical guidelines for psychological research. The intense experiences of the participants led to more careful consideration of participant well-being and more robust informed consent procedures for research involving psychological stress. However, the study has sometimes been misinterpreted in ways that are less helpful. Some have used it to argue that harsh treatment in prisons is inevitable, rather than changeable through policy reform. Others have cited it to excuse abusive behavior by authority figures, rather than holding people accountable for their choices. The experiment has also been referenced in discussions of military conduct, corporate management, and other hierarchical institutions. While these applications aren't necessarily wrong, they often oversimplify the complex relationship between individual choice, institutional culture, and situational pressures. Dr. Philip Zimbardo himself has been thoughtful about these applications, using his platform to advocate for prison reform and better training for people in positions of authority. He's acknowledged that the simple bad apples versus bad barrels framing can be limiting if it doesn't account for individual agency and the possibility of positive institutional change. More recent research on pro-social leadership, ethical decision-making in organizations, and positive institutional cultures provides a more complete picture of how authority relationships can be structured to encourage rather than discourage ethical behavior. The real value of the Stanford Prison Experiment may be less in its specific findings and more in the conversations it started about power, authority, and institutional responsibility. These are crucial discussions for anyone thinking about how to create more humane and effective institutions, whether in corrections, education, healthcare, or other settings where power differentials exist. Understanding both the insights and limitations of this famous study can help us think more clearly about these important questions without falling into either naive optimism about human nature or cynical pessimism about the possibility of positive change. We've reached the most important part of this investigation. Not just what really happened in the Stanford Prison Experiment, but what this case teaches us about how scientific research gets translated into public understanding and cultural narratives. The Stanford Prison Experiment became famous not just because of its findings, but because it told a compelling story that seemed to explain fundamental truths about human nature and social institutions. The dramatic narrative of ordinary people becoming monsters appealed to filmmakers, journalists, and educators looking for powerful examples to illustrate psychological concepts. But this is where things get complicated. The gap between what actually happened in a specific research study and what that study means for understanding human behavior in general is often much larger than popular accounts suggest. Scientific studies provide pieces of evidence about specific questions under particular conditions. They rarely provide simple universal truths about human nature. Dr. Mazarin Banaji, a Harvard psychologist who studies how scientific findings get communicated to the public, points out, the most dramatic and counterintuitive findings often get the most attention, but they're also the most likely to be oversimplified or misinterpreted. Good science is usually more nuanced and conditional than makes for compelling headlines. This doesn't mean we should ignore psychological research or that studies like the Stanford Prison Experiment have no value. It means we should approach scientific findings with appropriate curiosity and skepticism, understanding that individual studies are part of larger conversations rather than definitive answers to complex questions. The replication crisis in psychology, the discovery that many published findings can't be reproduced in follow-up studies, has led to important reforms in research methods, publication practices, and how scientists think about the relationship between individual studies and broader scientific knowledge. These reforms include requirements for larger sample sizes, pre-registration of research hypotheses, more transparent reporting of methods and data, and greater emphasis on replicating important findings before treating them as established facts. For those of us consuming scientific information rather than conducting research, this suggests some helpful approaches. Look for patterns across multiple studies rather than relying on single dramatic findings. Pay attention to methodology and sample sizes. Be skeptical of claims that seem too neat or universal. And remember that good science is an ongoing process of questioning and refinement rather than a collection of final answers. The Stanford Prison Experiment remains a valuable case study, not necessarily for what it proves about human nature, but for what it teaches us about the complexity of human behavior, the importance of research methodology, and the need for careful thinking about how we translate scientific findings into real-world understanding and policy. This kind of critical thinking about research doesn't undermine science, it strengthens it by helping us distinguish between solid findings and speculative interpretations, between careful conclusions and dramatic oversimplifications. The Stanford Prison Experiment represents both the power and the limitations of psychological research. It generated important insights about situational influences on behavior while also demonstrating how scientific findings can be oversimplified, overinterpreted, and transformed into cultural myths that don't fully reflect the complexity of the original research. The real story isn't that the experiment was fraudulent or worthless, but that it's one piece of evidence in ongoing conversations about human behavior, institutional design, and social change. Understanding both its contributions and its limitations helps us think more clearly about these important questions. This case also illustrates why scientific literacy matters for everyone, not just researchers. When we understand how studies are conducted, what their limitations are, and how findings should and shouldn't be interpreted, we're better equipped to participate in discussions about policy, social change, and human behavior. The most important question isn't whether the Stanford Prison Experiment was right or wrong, but how we can use it, along with many other sources of evidence and insight, to think more clearly about creating institutions and social arrangements that bring out the best in human nature, rather than the worst. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you noticed other examples of scientific studies that seem to have taken on lives of their own in popular culture? How do you approach evaluating claims about research findings, especially when they seem to confirm or challenge your existing beliefs about human nature? Share your observations in the comments. thoughtful discussion about how we interpret and apply scientific research benefits everyone. Critical thinking is a skill we can all develop and practice together. If this analysis helped you think differently about the relationship between scientific research and popular narratives, please subscribe for more content exploring the real stories behind famous studies and how we can become better consumers of scientific information. Share this video with someone who might be interested in the intersection of psychology, research methodology, and critical thinking. These conversations matter for how we understand ourselves and design better institutions and social policies. Remember, understanding science means understanding both what research can tell us and what questions remain open for continued investigation and discussion.